The FIFA World Cup has begun, and now the hosts, Qatar, are being criticised for political, economic, and cultural reasons. In particular, Western media outlets have criticised Qatar for human rights abuses, bribery in the bidding process, the inability to drink alcohol at games, and Qatar having a limited football history. The purpose of this video is to better understand these criticisms and the cultural divide between the West and the Arab world. You're watching All Things Humanities. Qatar has been criticised for the poor treatment of workers to build World Cup infrastructure. There are reports claiming that workers could not change jobs or even leave the country without the sponsor's permission. These criticisms from Western media outlets reflect Western power projection on Qatar and the Arab world, and perhaps this is a way for Western countries to influence the Arab world and project their understandings of work and labour onto them. It really goes to show the power that Western media outlets have on the world in shaping public opinion about the Middle East. After all, for those living in the West and watching this video, you're not exposed to the Middle Eastern or Qatari perspective. Nevertheless, workers were denied food and water and even had their papers taken away, and there are some arguments to say that a lot of these workers have been forced into labour. This comes under the kafala system that is used to monitor migrant labourers to help build industrial centres and infrastructure projects in countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, Lebanon and the like. These conditions are terrible, and interestingly enough, Western Europe no longer faces these problems, for it came across them during the Industrial Revolution, and throughout this period many people died from poor working conditions and working up to 14 to 16-hour days. It really goes to show how fast infrastructure projects with minimal regard to the needs of workers can severely impact their quality of life. While the West does have a problem with overworked and stressed out workers, ever since the pandemic, these problems are nothing like to what's happening in Qatar. This is important because this is also the first time a Middle Eastern country has hosted the World Cup, and Qatar has been able to bid roughly $200 billion to host it. It's interesting to think how industrialization, which has Western origins, of course from Britain, has allowed Qatar to build enough wealth through its large oil and gas exports to host such a massive event like the FIFA World Cup. Qatar have also been criticized for the prohibition of homosexuality. In Qatar, homosexuality is punishable by fines or even up to 7 years imprisonment. There are some reports showing that LGBT people have been subject to detention and even the death penalty in Qatar. It's important to remember that Qatar designates Islam as the state's religion, meaning that Islamic law is the main source of legislation, so it is totally justifiable that homosexuality is prohibited in the country. These criticisms derive from Western countries who are inspired by Enlightenment ideals of freedom and individual liberty, and these ideas have been able to flourish in Western Europe and also in North America. In January 2020, gay footballer Josh Cavallo said that if things can be changed, a lot of lives will be better, so I am excited to see what Qatar can do with this World Cup and if laws can be changed. This seems to be another example of how Enlightenment-inspired Western culture is at odds with the Islamic ideals of sexual behaviour in the Arab world. It also shows how, through an international event like the World Cup, great powers like those in the West are able to establish cultural norms through political, economic, and cultural pressure. One way of looking at this is to say that Western cultures are unwilling to accept the cultural and religious traditions of Qatar and feel like it's even their right to exert criticism on them. This is somewhat hypocritical given that we are educated about state sovereignty and the ability for individuals to make decisions for themselves. This seems like a bit of a Western intrusion into the Arab world because bodies like FIFA are attempting to normalize Western culture in the Middle East. This line of thinking applies to the issue of alcohol consumption at the World Cup. Originally, Qatar was willing to allow alcohol consumption during the event, but on November 18, which was a few days before the opening match, Qatar officially banned alcoholic beverages from sale within the 8 stadiums. Once again, this is a reflection of Sharia law, for the consumption of alcohol is prohibited in the Islamic tradition. This has caused outrage, especially to fans from the United Kingdom, where alcohol consumption and even drunkenness occurs at football games, often Issues like the use of alcohol and LGBT people in the World Cup reminds me of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis, which suggested that people's cultural and religious identities will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War era. While there aren't many serious conflicts happening between Qatar and the West at the moment, the point still remains. Western culture is clearly at odds with the ideals of the Arab world, and the FIFA World Cup is showing us this. The decision for Qatar to stick towards its cultural norms shows that despite Western criticism, individuals and therefore states will continue to act in alignment with their own beliefs and values. Western and Middle Eastern clashes of cultural, moral and economic beliefs shows that the ideas of both cultures are quite different. Arguably, this has spurred weaker arguments that Qatar ought not to host the World Cup because of their minimal football history. This video has shown that Western countries and Western culture is clearly still at odds with Islamic and Arab culture. While the World Cup has been in operation in Qatar and has remained quite peaceful, there are still differences in cultural and moral attitudes towards labour, homosexuality and alcohol. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing and liking the video for more content like this.